Hello, and welcome to the final episode in Infinite Care's three-part series, Navigating Dementia. Through these episodes, we've been hearing from Carolyn Cranwell. Carolyn supported her family and husband throughout his decline due to early onset Alzheimer's disease. She went on to write a book of their journey in the hope that carers of those with dementia may benefit from their family's experience. In this final chat with Carolyn, we broached the very powerful topics of grief and growth. Before we chat with Carolyn, let's take a quick look at some of the key messages from our last chat. Following a visit to the doctor to discuss an MRI, it helped Carolyn and others better understand what was going on for Richard if they imagined Richard's brain as having a massive traffic jam, where all the messages and pathways were getting confused or simply going nowhere at all. This was part of the process of becoming aware and then accepting the condition, both of which are critical to that powerful message of moving forward. Rather than immediately change everything at home, Carolyn decided to keep things as normal as possible for as long as possible. This included resisting the urge to stop working, change schools, or move house. If someone with dementia reaches the stage of needing to stop work, try a gradual approach. Reduce the number of days at work and substitute these with social activities. Preserving the dementia sufferer's dignity, self-respect, and sense of purpose should be a high priority. Maintaining those regular visits to the GP as the carer again provided useful guidance in how to deal with the necessary lifestyle changes. Day respite was critical in providing support to the family. In Carolyn's own words, it saved our lives.
Welcome back, Carolyn. Thank you very much. Here we are with our third and final discussion about your journey and the journey of Richard that you both made together, in fact. Through his transformation, from a fellow that was happily enjoying life with a wonderful family, with a small business, through to somebody who was diagnosed with dementia, early onset Alzheimer's, in fact, and then ultimately through to the point where he's now in permanent care, living in a nursing home, in fact, which of course I think for anybody is a significant piece of information to process. Regardless of age. I know that we work in the aged care industry and I deal with families every day who are looking at exploring opportunities for somebody in their family to come into aged care. And, most of the time they're what you and I would probably describe as fairly elderly. They're in their 70s, 80s and 90s. And yet Richard was still in his 60s when he became a permanent resident. This conversation today we've titled Grief and Growth. And for a lot of people, that title in itself is going to bring up a lot of questions about your story and probably also about themselves. Most people, I think, when we use the word grief, we put it into a little context, which is a fairly obvious one, and we think, oh yeah, okay, someone's died. Tell me about your grief.
Well, in our situation, David, I think it differs from people's normal conception of grief, because usually the grief is with the passing of the loved one. But in our situation, grief started early, right when we got the diagnosis, because you've been given a terminal life sentence. And you know that this person that you love is going to slip away from you a little bit every day, and you witness it, and there's nothing you can do about it. I've heard some people, some carers of people with dementia have said, oh, I wish it was cancer. And I'm kind of like, so to think about that first, I thought, because yes, there are operations you can have, there's medication, there's all sorts of treatment, same with a heart attack. There are things that people can do that give you hope. But for this, there is no cure at the moment. And so the grieving starts right from the beginning.
And you're there with that person every single day. Did you ever, I guess, identify to yourself that Richard was changing, and that changing was a deterioration or a decay of the person? Or was it just, oh, he's a bit slower today, or he's a bit more difficult today, and you just adapt and try and change that? Like, were you kind of covering it over almost?
No, the specialist had explained to me that his behaviour would, for a while, it might be sort of go along quite normal, and then it might suddenly just crash, plummet. And she also explained to me that it was his sort of behaviour. You were looking at it on a ruler, and there were different, indicators for each. Some skill might drop. Some might stay the same for a while. Then there might be a plummet, there'd be a crash. And so that helped me understand what was going on with him.
This grief that you talk about, which sounds like it was there for years. So you were actually in a state of grief for years. How did you express that? Like, were you able to allow yourself a bit of a cry, or an extra hug here and there? I mean, what did you do to actually?
Absolutely. I learnt not to become ashamed of tears, and I came to recognise the symptoms in myself when I thought, this is getting too much. It's almost like your emotions are like a bucket, and I could tell when my bucket was about to overflow. But I started to have this visual picture of my mother had a pressure cooker. You know those old-fashioned ones with the dials on the top? Yep, to let the steam off. And then I thought, well, my tears are really just like letting the steam off a little bit. And if that makes me feel better, so be it. So I learned that there's no shame in tears, and in recognising that.
You talk about this period of your life as dealing with ambiguous loss. Can you explain ambiguous loss? What does that mean to you?
Well, the concept of ambiguous loss is where you are clearly losing someone, but you either don't know what's happened to them, like the people that were on the MH370 plane, what happened to families after World War II, where you think the person has gone, but you just don't know where, and you don't have the proof. So there's no resolution. There isn't the full cycle of life in the grieving cycle, because the question is unanswered. So in our situation, we were losing Richard a little bit every day. It was happening in front of our eyes, and there was nothing that you could do about it.
When we've had a conversation previously, you spoke to me about what you refer to as the trilogy of grief. So we've got this ambiguous loss going on, where we're losing someone, but they're still there. And we've said a couple of times now that Richard didn't look unwell. He looked the same. So you've got this ambiguous loss where you're losing someone, but they look the same, so there's confusion and other things going on. It's a grief state. You're actually grieving, highly emotional. Talk to me about this trilogy of grief.
Well, the first stage that we've just discussed really plays with your mind, because you know that you're losing someone, but they look exactly the same.
When does that start?
Well, for me, it started from the diagnosis. And then as what I would call the middle section of grief is when the dementia has progressed significantly, but it's still in that what they call moderate condition, and it's becoming more and more noticeable. That was really the longest period, and that's the hardest. And that's when Richard had awareness, watching him struggle and knowing that you couldn't do anything to help. That was very emotional, very difficult, and that went on for a very long period of time. And then the third stage of grief is when someone passes, and then you sort of go through the whole thing again. It sort of almost sums it all up, but it's new grief, because it's a shock, to be honest, which sounds a ridiculous thing to say, but it's someone has been such a force in your life and has had lots of ups and downs, and all of a sudden they're not there.
How could somebody be better equipped to deal with this ambiguous loss, or this trilogy of grief. What would, if somebody was to walk in here right now who was in exactly the same position that you were in back then, what would you say to them to help them better prepare for what they're about to go through from a grief perspective?
Oh, that's a tall order. Just to sort of understand the process, and that that you would experience these different emotions, and not to say that the whole time that while we lived through these years that we didn't have happy moments as well. So there's shades of grey as well and light, but to understand the process, and that to recognise the fact that they are grieving, and that it's a part of this passage, this pathway that you're on, and to sort of to try and come to grips with it.
So is that an acceptance that the grief is going to be there, isn't it?
Yes.
It's really saying, hey, you're not actually going to get through this without having to put up with that bit as well.
Yes.
That's part of the deal.
There's no sugarcoating.
It's part of the deal.
Yeah.
So you're better off to accept it,
Yes.
to try and understand it as best as you can.
Yeah.
I know, again, from the conversation we had previously, that, and we mentioned it in one of the other conversations, that you maintained regular visits with your GP.
Yes.
Because that was helping you maintain that awareness, and it was helping you understand that for your own benefit,
Yes.
you needed to be nourishing yourself and trying to take some time out and so on and so forth. So, I think that possibly if we were to, again, pass on some advice to that person walking in the door right now, would you say that was an important strategy? Is that something that you would recommend?
Absolutely, because carers, like I said, this sneaks up on you very surreptitiously and silently, and you gradually, your life tends to sort of merge into the person that you're looking after. But you have to recognise that your life counts too, and particularly in a family dynamic, that everybody's life counts. We all need support during that time, and at times I had to make some really tough decisions, and it was a question of, well, which member of the family needs my support most? My son, who was the youngest, or Richard?
Yeah.
And so I had to make those tough decisions.
And you in the middle as well, because
that's the part
that's the part you get missing, right? To give yourself some of that attention.
I did.
Yeah.
Because my focus was so much outwardly on them that I didn't really look after myself very well. But my GP, once I started connecting with her, that was a huge help.
Yeah.
And so I had regular visits with her just to talk things through.
Yeah, fantastic. The kids also, although they were now much older than when all of this started, the kids also had to go through, from a fairly young age, grief as well. They may not know that it was grief, but they still had to go through it with you, and to a certain extent with Richard as well. So by the time that Richard's now in permanent care, and that grief, the ambiguous loss that you speak about, is well and truly front and centre. It's as plain as the nose on your face. What was the mindset of the kids at that stage? Like, were they emotional about where things were up to, or had they developed a thicker outer layer and they were just dealing with it? I mean, how would you describe it?
Well, they knew what was coming.
Yeah.
We all did.
Yeah.
So we knew that Richard would eventually have to go into care.
Yeah.
And they knew that he would get the support there, that we were no longer able to provide 24/7 care in the home, and they had sort of better resources and things that they could do to look after him, and it really was the best option. And they understood when I explained to them about what the doctor had said to me, that at least if we took that option, then we got to choose where he went.
Yes.
And it was also familiar to the children because they had been there. They'd gone and picked Dad up from the day centre.
Yeah.
So it was a familiar environment for them as well. So I think that the acceptance is assisted by that gradual transition and that familiarity.
Yes. And you actually opted not to discuss or involve the kids in the decision to move to permanent care?
Yeah, I did. I explained it to them that, you know, what the doctor had told me and the risk that Richard would have to go possibly somewhere that he wouldn't like, or where he'd be frightened and wouldn't know anyone. So they totally understood it from that point of view. But I didn't want them to have to sign the forms. I didn't want them to feel that they were responsible for admitting their father to care, because I just thought that was too much for young people to have to do.
There must have been a point through all of this, and we're now moving down a timeline, and you talk about things being inevitable. There must have been a point where you knew that Richard was not going to survive his disease, and that day was getting closer and closer. What did that time look like for you? Were there any changes in Richard that kind of were drawing or pointing to a conclusion?
Well, I think I had acceptance of that. I know I had acceptance of that fact, but I think I actually was partially in denial of that too, because we had so many incidents where, you know, he would have a fall and split his forehead and need care, and so I get these sort of crisis calls quite regularly. And I always thought that he would bounce back. So when he did, finally, you know, his time was near, it actually took me by surprise. I just thought he was like, you know, Houdini. He's just going to keep bouncing back. And I'd actually become conditioned to that. Because he'd been in residential care for 5 years. And so it wasn't until the staff told me that he was a bit reluctant to get out of bed in the morning and wasn't getting out until about lunchtime. And because I wasn't there, I didn't know that. That's when the alarm bells started to go off for me. And then I thought, well, I need to talk to the doctor, and that's when he told me things were getting serious.
Richard did pass away.
Yes.
What are you willing to share with us about that?
It took a long time. It took nearly a week. So it was a very gradual process. But I think that did help me. Once I realised that was happening, then I was able to face it better. I shared it with the children. They were, my son was interstate, my daughter was overseas. And so I explained to them, I said, this is what's happening. I said, look, it's entirely your choice what you do. Whether you decide to come back now or come when I call you. And they both opted to wait for the call. I thought that was actually the best choice because I didn't want them to be in this mercy dash situation. And I thought that would have just been more stressful. And knowing Richard as we all did, he was the least selfish person you could possibly imagine. And so he would have definitely said, it's up to you. Do what makes you feel comfortable. So I tended to look at the world through his eyes, and so that helped me.
Fantastic. It's a great strategy, isn't it? You know, trying to see it through you. Remember who he really is, not was. Is. He's still that person. You just can't show it, right? So, you know, I think it's fantastic that that you are able and willing to, as you say, see the situation through his eyes and behave accordingly. Richard's passed away. You had a service or a funeral for him. Did your emotions or your feeling about this loss or this grief change at that point? Or did they change over a period of time? I mean, I'm guessing that when we talk about that trilogy of grief, acceptance at the beginning, because that's from the diagnosis, so you've got to accept the fact that there's grief, and then we reach the inevitable conclusion. So there's more grief again, as you said, it kind of wraps everything up and just serves it back to you again. What happens to that grief? Does it stay as grief forever, or does it change? Does it affect you differently? What happened for you?
Well, for me, I gave myself time to grieve. I stayed in a family home, even though I was there alone. But I had been for a while because the children had left, they were young adults. And I just thought, I just need time to process this. But I didn't see that I had to stay in a state of grieving forever. Because I thought that would be the last thing that Richard would want me to do. To be curled up in the corner and crying and not being able to do anything. And so I thought, I can actually give myself permission to move forward, to release some of that grief. And I know some people are very sort of reluctant to do that because they feel they have to hold on to it, because if they're not holding on to the grief, that they're losing the person. But I didn't feel that at all. And so I thought what I have to do is to allow myself to just gradually release myself from that grief, and that I would be doing what Richard wanted me to do, which was to go on living. You know, and he would say, he would say, you've got your life. You should live it.
You actually almost took this grief and turned it into an energy which allowed you, in many respects, to grow, didn't you? You kind of, and I know you said to me before that you used the grief to give you energy to kind of hold things together, which is a really remarkable view of grief, because most people would see it as something that is quite a destructive emotion, whereas you used it as a building block, to some strength. So coming out of all of what you went through, did you change as a person?
Absolutely.
You had all that time and experience, and those little chuckles that we had along the way about the bus trips and things like that. And you had the reality of Richard passing and everyone else. I mean, did it change you?
Oh, totally.
Did it?
You learn to be more self-aware, so you know your strengths and weaknesses. You learn to be more resilient, to lead a more resilient life. And you begin to think of, I began to think of my emotions as a form of energy, and to turn that energy into something positive. Like I said, not to waste my life. And I thought, I need to, yes, I've been through this period of grief, but I need to do something positive. Once again, stepping back into Richard's eyes, and he would say, go on, get out there, do something, use your life. And I think it's very important for people to understand that the nature of dementia and the effect that it has on carers and on families is that it's very capable of taking two lives. And so I would say to people, don't let it take your life too. And that's no disrespect to the person that they're loving. In actual fact, I believe the best way to honour someone that you've lost is to lead a full and meaningful and happy life.
Very profound.
Thank you.
Which leads me to my final question. I actually have two, but I'm just going to ask one. And it's a question that you said that it was okay to ask. So prepare yourself, because it's your question. Are you happy with your life today?
I am. I can look you in the face and tell you that. The children are well adjusted, they're happy in their lives, their careers, their relationships, they're doing well. They are living the lives they would have lived if Richard hadn't got sick. So for me, that's success.
Well done. Thanks, Carol. This has been a three-part conversation. We've condensed a massive chunk of your very, very intimate and personal story. I know I'm extremely grateful. We've spent a few hours together over the last couple of weeks working through the things that we thought we could or should talk about and the things that you wanted to keep private. And I think that you've been exceptionally generous. So thank you for that. And I can only hope that people who are watching have taken note, and we'll give them some information shortly about how they can reach out to you if they'd like to learn more. And of course, maybe read more about the full story of you and Richard over this period of time.
Oh, thank you, David. I really appreciate that, and I really sincerely do hope that it helps others.
Carolyn again has shared some of the deeply personal family experience. Here are just a few of the messages from today's chat. Grief is part of the journey, and it may start when the diagnosis is first given. This ambiguous loss is part of the trilogy of grief, within which the key to carer's survival is acceptance that the grief will be present throughout. Carolyn learned early not to be ashamed of tears, and that allowing her emotions to take their natural course provided an outlet for the pressure that was building within. Again, we are reminded of the enormous benefits in staying close to your GP. These visits help Carolyn maintain focus on the simple fact that the lives and well-being of herself and the children also mattered. After Richard's passing, Carolyn allowed herself time to grieve his death. This was a different grief to the feelings of ambiguous loss. Give yourself permission to move forward, release the grief, and use the grief as a positive energy. Live the life that the dementia sufferer would have wanted for you. Thank you for being with us today. We trust that you found Carolyn Richard's story to be as meaningful as we did. That's the last in our three-part series, but of course there is still so much of the dementia story to be learnt and told. The Dementia Australia website has fantastic resources and information. When you have time, visit the site. Even a quick look will provide a wealth of informative and sometimes sobering facts on this group of diseases that affects around 450,000 Australians. If you'd like to know more about Carolyn and Richard's journey, visit Carolyn's website, www.navigatingalzheimers.com. Here you can purchase Carolyn's book, as well as access useful tips on dementia. If you'd like more information on respite or permanent care, or advice on where to seek more information on the topic of dementia, please visit the Infinite Care website.